People who had spent their lives fighting in the thick Vietnamese jungle often shared quiet warnings among themselves, and one of those warnings carried a weight unlike any other. They would tell each other to stay clear of Australian patrols because those men moved with an unnerving silence. They didn't announce their presence with noise or commotion. They didn't stumble through the trees like most foreign troops. They simply appeared, slipping out of the undergrowth as if the jungle itself had shaped them. And these warnings didn't come from American commanders or political briefings meant to boost morale. They came straight from the Viet Cong's own internal reports, handwritten notes and typed assessments, where the enemy openly admitted that the Australians behaved in ways they couldn't anticipate, couldn't track, and often couldn't counter. Those Australian infantrymen, ordinary diggers by name but anything but ordinary in action, slowly earned a reputation that stretched far beyond the areas they patrolled. In the long grinding years of the Vietnam War, they became the foot soldiers that opposing units hoped they wouldn't cross. And to understand how that reputation formed, you have to go back to the moment Australia formally committed troops in 1965. Unlike many nations arriving fresh to the terrain, Australian forces carried a long shadow of experience behind them. Their soldiers had fought across the Pacific during the Second World War, pushing through humid jungles and steep ridges. They had walked endless miles through Malayan plantations during the emergency, tracking insurgents who hid among the rubber trees. They had hunted guerrillas across the mountains of Borneo, learning to survive in a world where the forest swallowed everything. That experience didn't live only in training manuals or barracks lectures. It had seeped into their military culture. These were men who valued practicality far more than theatrics. They didn't ask for speeches or chest-thumping confidence. They believed in fulfilling the task, protecting their mates, and making it back home in one piece. For many of them, skills that armies spent months teaching, following tracks, sensing shifts in terrain, identifying subtle disturbances in foliage, already belonged to them from childhood spent in the Australian bush. The army simply sharpened instincts that were already alive and well inside them. There was another trait woven through their ranks, something subtle but unmistakable. A certain quiet determination. A refusal to make noise unless noise was necessary. Other armies talked endlessly about strategy and procedures, but Australians preferred to demonstrate tactics through action. Slow, efficient, sharply calculated action. This difference in attitude set them apart, but their reputation among the Viet Cong was built on something even more striking. Captured VC documents revealed an unmistakable pattern over time. Australian patrols were highlighted as threats that required caution. Maps were marked with circles around areas where Australians were known to operate. Instructions were issued advising local units to avoid engaging them unless absolutely required. This wasn't based on rumor or superstition. It was based on repeated encounters where VC fighters discovered just how differently Australians moved through the jungle. American patrols, for all their firepower, often gave their presence away long before they arrived. Metal gear clattered. Heavy boots snapped dry branches. Voices drifted through the foliage. Their large unit formations made them predictable and easy to track. The Viet Cong knew how to intercept them, how to anticipate their direction, how to prepare ambushes. But the Australians seemed to melt through the terrain. A dozen men could glide between trees almost without sound. They used hand signals instead of constant radio chatter. They studied every broken branch and softened patch of earth, alert to traps and ambush sites before the enemy had time to realize they were being watched. Instead of walking into danger, they located it first, and that unsettled the Viet Cong more than any weapon ever could. This was especially troubling for an enemy that prided itself on mastering guerrilla warfare. The Viet Cong had defeated the French before the Americans arrived. They knew the jungle like their own heartbeat. They had built their entire identity on outmaneuvering larger conventional forces. Yet here was an opponent who understood the jungle almost exactly as they did. Small teams, endless patience, slow movements, complete invisibility. They found themselves facing an enemy who wasn't hindered by their tactics, but instead mirrored them, and in some areas surpassed them. There was an unspoken truth buried inside those assessments that rarely reached Australian ears during the war, and still isn't widely known even now. The Viet Cong didn't shy away from Australian patrols only because they were difficult to fight. They stepped back because they respected the skill. Professional respect, born from recognition of another fighter who had earned it, not through brutality or numbers, but through discipline and mastery. Australian small units ventured deep into territories where other forces hesitated to go. They navigated areas where the canopy pressed down so thickly that daylight faded into a permanent dusk. They ambushed enemy routes that were thought to be safe. They observed troop movements that slipped past other units entirely. And when clashes erupted, they responded with a level of control that could shift the outcome instantly. There was no panic, no uncontrolled bursts of gunfire ripping blindly into trees. They fired only when needed, maneuvered with precision, and coordinated artillery with deadly accuracy. And just as quickly as they arrived, they would slip away, leaving little for reinforcements to retaliate against. This level of effectiveness wasn't built on brute force. It wasn't driven by rage or recklessness. It was built on understanding the environment, reading the enemy, and maintaining control even under fire. It was a form of professionalism that took years to shape and even longer to perfect. But being feared in war isn't as glamorous as it sounds. It sits on the shoulders of men who carried responsibilities most people never see and rarely talk about. To understand why the Viet Cong viewed Australian diggers the way they did, you must first understand how those patrols actually operated beyond the myths and the dramatized portrayals. A typical patrol consisted of around 10 to 12 soldiers, sometimes even fewer. Each man carried a load that often reached 40 kilograms, packed with ammunition, water, rations, medical gear, and personal essentials. They would spend days, sometimes weeks, moving through areas controlled entirely by the enemy without immediate support behind them. Spacing was a lifeline, 20 to 30 meters between each soldier. Too close and one burst of fire could tear through the line. Too distant and visibility vanished in the dense vegetation. Maintaining that distance took constant awareness. Talking was non-existent, not reduced, completely absent. Every bit of communication happened through gestures. A closed hand meant halt. A pointed finger identified movement ahead. A single tap on a weapon signaled danger close. Each man covered a specific arc in front, beside, or behind him. Their sectors overlapped with precision so that no angle was left unobserved, and no soldier accidentally fired across another's line of sight. If fire came from a particular direction, only the men responsible for that angle returned fire, while others immediately shifted to guard vulnerable sides. What made their movements so effective wasn't luck or sudden genius. Their reactions were so thoroughly trained that no one had to pause and think through what to do next. Every motion had been practiced until it lived in their muscles. They advanced at a pace that would frustrate anyone unfamiliar with their method. Sometimes taking an hour to cover a distance most people could walk in minutes. The man at the front, carrying the burden of being the first to encounter danger, studied the ground with the care of someone reading a fragile map. Every footfall was deliberate. He searched for thin wires hidden in shadows, for unusual shapes in foliage, for the faintest indication that someone else had disturbed the area recently. Just behind him, a second soldier scanned the same terrain from a slightly different view, allowing two minds to interpret the signs that one pair of eyes might miss. The patrol commander followed, guiding the team's direction and rhythm. Riflemen moved behind him in their own order, their roles understood without conversation. Then came the machine gunner, carrying the heaviest weapon and the heaviest responsibility. And at the very rear was the soldier known as Tail End Charlie, walking backward more often than forward, always monitoring the path they had just traveled to ensure no one was following. Their awareness extended beyond simply spotting danger ahead. They were equally focused on not leaving a trail behind. They stepped into shallow creeks whenever possible, placed their boots on stones and fallen logs to avoid footprints, swept out marks in soft earth, and occasionally looped back on their own route to check for pursuers. Their discipline bordered on ritual. No one reached for a cigarette. No one whispered without absolute necessity. A cough was held back until the lungs burned. Weapons stayed on safe until a threat was practically in sight. Magazines secured in pairs, bush style, were checked over and over for mud or dampness. This level of care meant that ambushing an Australian patrol was extraordinarily hard, and Viet Cong fighters would prepare a killing field, set their traps, and lie in blistering heat for hours, only to realize the Australians had noticed the subtle clues and slipped away without giving them a chance. And the worst outcome for the VC was when the Australians didn't simply avoid the ambush, but quietly maneuvered behind it, turning the trap onto its creators. Imagine being one of those VC fighters. You're hidden in a position that has worked flawlessly against American units. You're confident. You've used this ground before and know exactly how your enemy usually approaches. Then, out of nowhere, you hear a soft cough behind you, just one. You turn your head and find an Australian soldier stand barely 10 meters away, weapon raised and steady. You never heard a footstep, never sensed movement, never saw a shadow. That moment alone explains why Australian patrols carried such a heavy reputation. Yet their tactical skill, as sharp as it was, wasn't the full story. The real strength that carried them through impossible situations came from something inside them. It was their mental steadiness, a calm that didn't disappear even when bullets snapped through leaves or explosions tore chunks out of the earth. They weren't fearless in the sense of being unaware of danger. They simply refused to let fear break their focus. When chaos erupted around them, when the jungle roared with gunfire and shouts, the Australians slowed their breathing and sharpened their thoughts. Every decision became intentional, every shot carefully placed. There was a strange form of humor among them too, dark and dry. The kind that surfaces when survival depends on staying grounded. Men would crack quiet jokes while waiting for evacuation helicopters or tease one another during mortar fire. It wasn't showing off. It wasn't defiance. It was a release, a way to keep their sanity intact in a world designed to strip it away. What tied them together more than anything else was trust. Absolute, unquestioned trust. A man didn't have to watch his own blind spots because he knew someone else already was. He never wondered if his section would come for him if he fell. He knew they would without hesitation. That trust turned a group of individuals into a single being. An Australian section didn't fight as separate men. They moved like different limbs of the same body. Each soldier understood instinctively where the others would be, what they would cover, when they would shift positions. Words were almost unnecessary. Their movements synced naturally. When one fired, another adjusted. When one moved, another provided cover without needing to be told. Their combat philosophy reflected this unity. They valued precision above brute force, short bursts instead of spraying rounds, aimed fire instead of wasteful volleys. They trained to make each shot matter, and they followed that principle religiously. When contact was made, everything followed an unspoken rhythm. Sometimes the first warning wasn't a sound, but something more subtle, soil disturbed in an unusual way. A faint scent carried by the breeze, or simply a gut feeling born from experience. The patrol would freeze. The message would travel silently down the line through a sequence of hand signals. Each man would lower his body into whatever cover the jungle offered, blending into roots, bushes, or fallen leaves as if sinking into water. The commander would judge the situation with the speed of someone who had done it countless times. Was this a small enemy patrol? An ambush site? A camp? Were they about to walk into danger, or had they caught the enemy unaware? If the situation called for withdrawal, they didn't retreat blindly. They executed a practiced break contact maneuver. Designated riflemen laid down accurate suppressing fire while others moved back a few meters, then covered the next group's movement. Smoke grenades would bloom to hide their withdrawal, and within moments they would melt back into the jungle, unreachable before the enemy could organize a chase. But when the Australians had the advantage, the story changed entirely, and this was where the Viet Cong faced their greatest fear. Instead of charging head-on or waiting for artillery to do the work, Australians would slide to the flanks. One group would pin the enemy with sharp, accurate fire while another section circled quietly through the jungle's shadows, appearing on the side or rear of the enemy position. The VC would suddenly realize fire was coming from a direction they hadn't prepared for. Confusion would set in. They'd attempt to shift their lines, but by then it was too late. Artillery called by a forward observer, someone who could calculate distances and grid references by memory alone, would begin to pound the area. sealing the outcome before the VC could adapt. Half a minute after a firefight ended, the Australians would already be withdrawing, moving quickly but methodically to put distance between themselves and the battle site before the Viet Cong could regroup. The transition from lethally precise action to swift disappearance was seamless. That blend of efficiency and composure was what defined them. It wasn't superior weaponry or overwhelming numbers that shaped their reputation. It was the raw, undeniable mastery that radiated from every movement they made. Skill, sharpened through years of harsh experience, was the foundation. But there was another side to their fearsome reputation, a darker truth that didn't come from their abilities alone, but from what they were asked to endure. This is the part of the story that rarely reaches people who never served, the part that even many Australians back home never truly grasped. When you were the most capable soldiers in a theater of war, you didn't get the easy assignments. You were sent to handle the missions that no one else wanted. The long-range reconnaissance patrols, the deep incursions far beyond Allied lines. The area is so thick with enemy presence that sending a larger force was viewed as inviting disaster. Those tasks went to Australian sections. If a region had become too deadly, if ambushes were increasing, if intelligence was outdated or disappearing altogether, Australian infantry were the ones who stepped in. And they were expected to succeed every single time. They operated with very limited support. Where American units often had the luxury of immediate airstrikes, gunships, artillery, or rapid reinforcements, and Australian patrols frequently moved too far into hostile terrain for any of that to reach them in time. If something went wrong, and something always could, they had to fight their own way out, using only what they had carried on their backs. This created a mountain of pressure that went beyond the weight of gear. There was the physical strain of marching through suffocating humidity while carrying loads heavy enough to crush knees and shoulders. But the psychological toll was far heavier. You never had a moment where you could let your guard down. Every sound, every smell, every tiny inconsistency in the forest demanded your full attention. A single misplaced footprint, the wrong kind of silence, a bird call that seemed rehearsed rather than natural. All of it could signal an ambush waiting ahead. Rest didn't come in long stretches, and it arrived in thin slices of time, short rotations where you lay down with your gear still on, closing your eyes only because you trusted the man next to you to watch over you. True sleep, the kind that resets the mind, was impossible for weeks on end. The jungle punished them constantly. Rain soaked them until their skin softened and cracked. Sweat and humidity worked their way into every crease. Crossing streams left their uniforms clinging to their bodies. Jungle rot crept into their feet, and leeches clung to their legs without them noticing until the patrol finally halted. Packs carved into their shoulders. The slow, careful pace forced by jungle movement strained their knees until every climb or descent felt like torture. Their feet, trapped in wet boots day after day, developed infections that grew worse with every hour, and food was limited because carrying extra meant sacrificing ammunition or water. By the time a patrol returned to base, men were thinner, pale with fatigue, and sometimes barely standing. Yet, after only a short period of recovery, they were sent out again. But none of that, the exhaustion, the weight, the sickness, was the hardest burden. The most crushing pressure came from responsibility. Most Australian soldiers weren't terrified of dying. What dug deep into their minds was the idea of failing the men beside them. The fear of missing a sign, of reacting a second too late, of making one mistake that could cost a mate his life. That fear followed them every moment they were in the jungle. It shaped how they moved, how they thought, how they fought. It created a silent weight that every man carried alone, even though the entire group felt it. When someone was hit, you didn't leave them behind. You lifted them onto your back, took their gear as well as your own, and pushed through terrain that resisted every step. You carried them for kilometers if that's what it took, stumbling through mud, ducking under vines, pushing through foliage that clawed at your clothing. And you kept going even when your lungs burned, when your arms trembled, when your legs felt ready to collapse. You carried them because you knew they would do the same for you without hesitation. There were stories hidden behind quiet voices, memories shared only with those who understood. Patrols marching on, even after men passed out from heat, soldiers with untreated wounds refusing to pull back because the mission mattered more. Men who pushed themselves so far past the edge that when they finally returned to base, they had nothing left. And none of it came from a desire to be heroic. It wasn't some dramatic search for glory. It came from something far more personal. The word mate, so casually tossed around in everyday life, held a much deeper meaning in the jungle. It wasn't just friendship. It was a bond wrapped in sacrifice, in shared danger, in a trust so absolute that it could override fear itself. Your mates were the only people who truly understood the world you were walking through. They were the ones who could read the exhaustion in your eyes, who could steady your shaking hands, who could pull you forward when your strength was gone. That loyalty forged soldiers who didn't quit, who couldn't quit, because stopping meant abandoning the men they trusted with their lives. And that idea was unbearable. But such unrelenting commitment carried a cost that didn't end when the war was over. The intense alertness that kept them alive in the jungle didn't disappear when they set foot back on Australian soil. It clung to them long after the fighting ended. Years later, some would jolt awake in the middle of the night, heart hammering in their chest because some sound or imagined sound triggered the instincts they'd learned to rely on. Many veterans found themselves choosing the chair in a room that allowed them to see every entrance and exit, because sitting with their back exposed felt wrong, even unsafe. Crowded places with strangers brushing past from all sides were uncomfortable to the point of panic. The silence they had wielded like a weapon in the jungle now became something that trapped them, isolating them from the world they were supposed to return to. For a lot of them, talking about the war felt impossible. It wasn't that they were trying to hide some secret. It was that no combination of words could ever recreate the feeling of moving through the jungle, knowing your life and your mate's life hung on tiny details. And then there was the guilt, a constant presence that crept into quiet moments. Why did they survive when others didn't? Why did fate place them on leave the week their section walked into an ambush? Why did a bullet shift direction just enough to miss them, but strike a mate standing inches away? These questions didn't have answers, yet they echoed through their minds for decades. This was the real cost, not just the scars on the skin, but the wounds buried deep in the mind, the ones earned by being exceptional at something that demanded they live permanently on the knife edge of survival. Being feared by the enemy was a strategic advantage in Vietnam. But once the war ended, that same identity became a weight they had to carry in silence. Returning home should have brought relief, but instead it added another layer of burden. Imagine spending months in the jungle with men who would lay down their lives for you, completing missions that demanded absolute commitment and proved you were capable of meeting impossible standards. Then, you come home to a country divided over the war. It's the late 60s, then the early 70s. Public opinion has turned sour. Protests fill city squares. People are shouting at soldiers, calling them murderers, blaming them for decisions made far above their pay grade. You expect a welcome, maybe even gratitude, but instead you're met with coldness and accusations. There were no victory parades. Instead, returning soldiers were told not to wear their uniforms outside because it might attract hostility. Friends didn't know how to ask what had happened or how to respond even if you tried to explain. Employers hesitated to hire veterans, assuming they would be unstable or violent. So many soldiers simply hid it all away. They packed their uniforms in the back of cupboards, avoided mentioning their service, and tried to slip quietly back into civilian life, hoping no one would look too closely at the shadows they carried. For countless Australian Vietnam veterans, the silence at home was harder to endure than the jungle. In the jungle, their purpose was clear. Their mates understood them. Their skills mattered. They knew exactly who they were and what they were fighting for each day. But back home, they were expected to blend into a world that had no idea what they'd been through. They carried memories that few could imagine. The restless nights, the constant scanning of every environment, the sudden flinch at sharp noises, the difficulty forming close connections after losing friends in battle, because part of them feared experiencing that loss again. There was no real system to help them. PTSD hadn't entered mainstream vocabulary yet. The leftover term from earlier wars, shell shock, was usually dismissed as weakness. Men were expected to swallow their trauma and get on with life. And so they did. They found jobs where they could. They married, raised children, tried to live normal lives. Yet they did all of it while carrying psychological wounds no one understood, let alone treated. Many veterans felt forgotten, abandoned by the very country they served so fiercely. They had acted with discipline, courage, and professionalism. They had survived some of the harshest fighting conditions Australian forces had ever faced. And when they came home, the nation largely turned its back on them. Real recognition didn't come until many years later, long after the psychological damage had set in. But something else was unfolding during those decades. Something most Australians never knew. While veterans struggled with silence and indifference at home, militaries around the world were quietly studying the methods Australians had used in Vietnam. American analysts took a hard look at Australian patrol practices and noticed that their casualty rates were significantly lower, and their reconnaissance missions far more successful. Their ambush setups were models of efficiency. Their discipline in movement and noise control outperformed larger, better-equipped units. Reports were compiled, lessons were documented, entire training curriculums were adjusted. British forces began integrating elements of Australian jungle doctrine. American Special Operations units adopted Australian approaches to stealth and patrol spacing. Several Southeast Asian militaries updated their jungle warfare programs based on Australian experience. While the men who developed those tactics lived quietly among civilians who barely acknowledged their service, military professionals across the globe were learning from them, adapting their techniques and passing those lessons down to future generations of soldiers. What Australian soldiers achieved in Vietnam wasn't simply impressive. It stood far above the standard. They didn't just perform well in jungle warfare, they elevated it. They took the core principles of infantry combat and pushed them to a level that many modern armies still struggle to reach. The fusion of discipline, calm judgment, patience, and razor-sharp tactical awareness demonstrated by their small patrols eventually became the model others tried to study and replicate. But back home, hardly anyone knew. Their countrymen were unaware that these same soldiers, who walked through civilian streets carrying invisible wounds, had set a benchmark respected across the world. They didn't know that military schools quietly dissected Australian patrol reports to learn how such small teams accomplished what entire battalions couldn't. They didn't know that when experts discussed the most effective jungle operations ever carried out, they were referencing actions taken by Australians in the thick vegetation of Phuoc Tuy. Yet slowly, over many years, recognition began to grow. Veteran organizations rose from the silence. They campaigned for understanding, for memorials, for proper support, for the simple acknowledgement that service meant sacrifice. And gradually, Australia listened. Belated welcome home marches were organized. Names were carved into stone. Ceremonies honored Vietnam veterans beside those from earlier wars, and the phrase, "lest we forget," finally widened to include the men who fought in Southeast Asia. It couldn't erase the long years of being overlooked, but it mattered. And alongside that shift, another truth surfaced, one the Viet Cong had understood from the beginning. Australian infantrymen in Vietnam belonged among the most capable soldiers of their era, not because of patriotic slogans or inflated storytelling, but because their achievements were measurable, consistent, and forged under some of the toughest conditions imaginable. That legacy didn't fade with time. Modern Australian infantry still trains according to principles shaped in Vietnam decades earlier. The uncompromising focus on noise discipline, the careful spacing, the methodical pace, the habit of reading terrain like a book, none of it disappeared. It became doctrine. It became muscle memory for new generations. Australia's Special Air Service Regiment and commando units still rely heavily on skills first proven in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy, operating in small teams deep inside hostile regions, waiting long stretches for the right moment to strike, maintaining composure under crippling stress. These traits weren't inventions of the modern era. They were inherited from the diggers who walked through Vietnam's forests and showed that such methods worked. Whenever Australian Special Forces deploy today, whether it's in Afghanistan, in Iraq, or remote corners of the world, they stand on a foundation laid by men who faced an enemy that had defeated major colonial forces and was challenging a global superpower. Honoring that legacy doesn't happen primarily through speeches or medals. It lives in the standards Australia still upholds. It lives in the expectation of professionalism, patience, and precision. The Australian Army's reputation for silent, disciplined patrolling and small unit independence comes directly from those who perfected the craft decades earlier. The world eventually came to understand what Australia itself took too long to realize. Its soldiers had set a gold standard in jungle warfare. They fought with a level of discipline and unity that few armies have ever achieved. They earned their respect not through myth-making, but through proven excellence. So, why exactly were the Viet Cong more wary of Australian diggers than of any other infantry they encountered? The truth is straightforward. There was no mystery, no exaggeration, just the undeniable facts. They were quiet. While other forces could be heard long before they arrived, Australians slipped through the forest as if they belonged there. The Viet Cong often had no warning until the Australians were already in position. Tracking them was nearly impossible. Hearing them approach was even harder. They were disciplined. Every soldier understood his exact role. Every movement was intentional. Panic never spread through their ranks because their reactions had been rehearsed 1,000 times. They moved with a level of control that left no room for mistakes. They were patient. They didn't rush into fights. They observed, waited, built a picture of the enemy, and acted only when the timing gave them an enormous advantage. Their restraint made them unpredictable. They could read the jungle. Australian soldiers could interpret signs with the same fluency the Viet Cong relied on. They knew how many enemies had passed, how recently, and where they were headed. That ability stripped the Viet Cong of one of their greatest strengths. They were accurate. They didn't waste ammunition. Every round had purpose. Their controlled bursts and steady aim meant that even a smaller force could deliver devastating fire when it mattered. They worked independently. Australian patrols didn't rely on constant orders from headquarters. They analyzed situations on the ground and acted immediately, adapting faster than the enemy could adjust. They reacted to changing situations with instinctive adaptability, relying on their own initiative instead of waiting for direction from far-off commanders. They accepted responsibility for whatever happened, good or bad, because that was part of their identity as frontline soldiers. And above all, they carried something deeply Australian, mateship. That bond, forged in hardship, turned individual men into a force far greater than the sum of their parts. They didn't fight for medals or slogans or speeches. They fought for the man standing beside them. And that loyalty made them relentless. None of this was exaggerated. It wasn't some myth told years later to soften the memory of a hard war. The official reports documented it. The casualty ratios confirmed it. Even the Viet Cong's own records acknowledged it. Australian infantry reached a level of small unit effectiveness in Vietnam that modern militaries still study because very few forces have ever matched it. But behind that excellence were human beings, not flawless warriors from a storybook. They were young, most barely into adulthood, who boarded ships and aircraft without truly understanding what waited for them on the other side of the world. They were strong because the job demanded it, yet they felt everything ordinary men feel. They were frightened at times. They mourned when they lost mates. They wrestled with the things they witnessed, and through all of it, they remained humble. They weren't chasing admiration. They weren't looking to stand out. They simply wanted to complete their mission, protect each other, and survive long enough to return home. Their sense of humor helped them carry the weight. It was that dry, understated Australian wit that found something to laugh at, even in the middle of chaos. It reminded them of who they were, before the war pushed them into situations no one is truly prepared for. Their practicality kept them grounded, too. They never dressed up combat as something glorious. They understood it for what it really was. Dangerous, exhausting, ugly work that still had to be done by someone willing to shoulder the burden. What set them apart most was loyalty. A deep, unwavering loyalty that reached far beyond uniforms and ranks. It revealed itself in countless quiet actions. A soldier staying awake through a long, freezing night so his mate could rest. Someone carrying a friend's extra ammunition when the load became too heavy. Men moving toward the sound of gunfire because members of their section were under threat. This wasn't flashy courage meant for headlines. It was the quiet sort, the kind that shows itself in moments when no one is watching. They weren't larger-than-life heroes. They were everyday Australians from suburbs, small towns, remote farms, wealthier neighborhoods, and humble working-class homes. Some joined the regular army because they wanted to prove something to themselves or find direction. Others were conscripts, plucked by the lottery and sent into a conflict they had never imagined being part of. But once they entered the jungle, none of those differences mattered. What mattered was competence, reliability, and trust. You were judged by whether you could do your job and whether the men around you believed you wouldn't fail them. And they performed their duties for years in conditions that most people can barely visualize, maintaining a standard of professionalism that won respect from allies and even from the enemy they fought. But beneath the tactics and the recognition, something more important remains. Something that should outlast all the analysis. They were Australians, men who answered the call when the country sent them, men who endured hardships few civilians can comprehend, men who buried friends and carried memories that shaped their lives long after they returned home. They didn't march into Vietnam wanting to be feared. They didn't seek a legendary reputation. They simply did what Australian soldiers have always done: showed up, carried their share of the load, looked after their mates, and did their duty with quiet pride. And avoid Australian patrols. They are too quiet. They appear behind you. Those lines were not whispered by American commanders or repeated in political speeches. They were warnings written by the Viet Cong themselves, based on first-hand encounters with an enemy they couldn't anticipate, couldn't track, and often couldn't escape. Australian diggers became the most respected and most feared infantry in the Vietnam War because of skill, discipline, and unity. By the time their country committed troops in 1965, those soldiers brought with them a depth of jungle experience few nations could match. They had fought in the dense, steaming battles of the Pacific in World War II. They had walked the rubber estates of Malaya hunting insurgents. They had climbed the rugged mountains of Borneo tracking experienced guerrillas. And from each campaign, they carried lessons that shaped the way they moved, fought, and survived. But it wasn't just experience. It was identity. Australian soldiers were grounded and realistic. They didn't crave speeches or spotlight moments. They valued results, teamwork, and survival. And from that mindset came the professionalism that made them one of the most effective infantry forces of their generation.